they had all their helicopter fleet grounded, and they had kind of major problems and multiple helicopters crash. The whole fleet was grounded for investigation. And when you have a conflict, you have to resupply the troops in the mountains, and you're using donkeys for that. That's the harsh reality. And they learned the lesson. That should never happen again. We have to be prepared, to resupply the troops at any cost.
Welcome to PEP, the Protect Europe podcast, where we interview founders and investors building the technology that protects Europe's values, way of life, and infrastructure.
Okay, but let's start with Vilnius, which is where you're from, Donatas, is the CK from the center of Europe.
Yes.
Geographical center of Europe. Tell me about that, because this is new to me. And I've been to Vilnius, I've had the hot chocolate, I've enjoyed the sights. I didn't realize it was that close to the center of Europe.
So there's nothing to see. You just have a kind of a little bit of a hill, a milestone, and it says this is their geographical center of Europe is. And we are always concerned that, should some evil willing dictator decide to press the button, well, he would ultimately aim at the center of Europe. Yeah, so...
But it's okay, because I can't think of any evil villains around in the world today. Sorry, that is definitely a joke. I can give you a list, but maybe this is a podcast that would take too long. But anyway, Donatas, tell us about your company, right? What do you guys do?
So at Airvolve, we are building a new kind of aircraft mobility solution, a platform which we hope can replace helicopters as a cheaper and more scalable alternative in the near future. It's not an idea that came to our heads, some time ago. It's just a problem our clients had, and we try to address it again and again. Helicopters are very expensive to purchase, to operate, to maintain later. And if you represent, a country which is not in the center of Europe, like not Germany, not France, not Switzerland, not Norway, but something around the Schengen periphery, you have this problem. So approximately 5 years ago, we started cracking this problem, and now I think we have a solution to prove it. So that's what we built. It wasn't easy. Couldn't actually use legacy technology to take on helicopters because, they built in their robust manner. They have a lot of components which cannot fail. If they fail, everything falls from the sky. And that's the reason they are so expensive. Very good machinery, very useful machinery, but it has to be reliable, and therefore it's expensive. And, so approximately 4 years ago, then the war in Ukraine has started. I pitched this idea to the local, business angel community. They had a very fancy event, I was actually doing a real elevator pitch, like you are in the elevator, you have 30 seconds because this elevator is within the telco tower, which is like 100 plus meters tall. And this is where I pitched this new kind of aircraft for the first time ever. And now, after 4 years, we have it flying.
Okay, I have so many questions. I'm sure Marty is too. But first of all, I love someone who's talk about the problem first, rather than their solution. Because I think you've always got to, as any startup, fall in love with the problem. Because the first idea you come up with isn't necessarily the best idea. And then, what were you doing waiting around for this problem to arrive? Because it sounds like you said that the customers brought the problem to your door. What were you doing before this?
So I was, starting my first company, which was, coordinating large European consortiums, and we tried to raise 100 plus million euros to, tackle these huge problems Europe was facing, in 2018 and 2016, migrant crisis, the wildfires, bushfires across the world. Then we had earthquakes, floods. Then, we had all these green initiatives, sustainable cities. And there was one common denominator to all these problems, mobility. Mobility in a way that, have to respond to any kind of threat in the shortest time frame possible. Huge money were put to address these problems. And, there were no solutions. So having spoken to like 50 or so organizations which physically perform search and rescue disaster relief missions. We realized that guys in Greece are still dragging tanks of water on their shoulders to the hills, distinguish fires because we cannot afford helicopters. This is happening in 21st century. Okay, so this is a huge problem, and this is how we ended up, doing, kind of trying to crack these problems for kind of Europeans, basically. So
Okay,
it's a
that
parent
makes
company.
sense. That
Yeah.
makes sense. So in my head, because this, and then I want to let Marty jump in. In my head, there was a British TV series called Thunderbirds, right, which was all about international rescue, and there was always a poly crisis going on somewhere, and a team of very talented people, puppets, sadly, had a range of vehicles that they used to use to basically solve the world's problems, right? Probably didn't air in Lithuania, or you're far too young to remember it, right? But this is kind of where I'm channeling the vibe, which is how do you deal with this mobility crisis? How do you solve these problems at huge scale? And how do we use modern technology? And if we're not using helicopters, are we using flying cars? Okay, Marty, you can come in with some questions, and then we need to dig into how do we do this?
Well, I mean, of course, my first comment is Thunderbirds are go.
Of course.
So that was how it all started. I mean, I've checked your webpage, and there is actually very little information, only the top line thing. I also checked whatever you've put into the YouTube, and very short snippets of videos were found. And I would, of course, be very, very interested in asking the technical question: how is your product better than the traditional helicopter? I mean, I think I understand how it works, but it's still the question is that why that specific construction, and are there any other, let's say, vertical take-off gadgets that are using the same principle?
Yeah, that's a tough question, a big one, as a matter of fact. So again, there was no need to use this technology whatsoever, but we had requirements from the clients, potential clients, and all these rescue organizations, the military actors who were sinking people in the sea. So they kind of gave us three issues to address. First was definitely the price factor. It has to be cheap. Cheap in a sense that price per flight hour of a helicopter equals basically a salary of first responder in Europe, monthly salary. You can tell it's a lot, you can tell it's a little, but that's the reality. Price is an issue. The second problem is, the deployment of these aircraft to the, let's say, disaster area or rapid deployment anywhere. You have to park them, you have to store them, you have to distribute across particular territory. Even then, if you want to engage into mission, you have to, refuel them, you have to fly them to the particular site, then you have to go back. So this kind of tactical deployment or capability to transport aircraft on road to the disaster site was another requirement, because it's cheaper to transport an aircraft on road than for it to fly, let's say, for an hour to the disaster site. Sounds stupid, but cost related. So we had another requirement to make it tactically transportable. Okay. And third issue, everyone was claiming the same noise and kind of hesitation from local communities to see these things buzzing above their heads. So if you can address size issue, if you can address noise issue, and if you can address price issue, you have a solution and potential list of clients. Sounds easy, but it's really hard. The hardest of those is, the size, and the larger the aircraft, the more expensive it is. So in our space, it's like the volume of aircraft equals its price. If you can make it 2 times shorter, you reduce the volume 2 times 2 times 2 is 8 times. So by shrinking it 2 times, you make it 8 times cheaper. Okay, so it matters. Then we couldn't use any kind of classical technology like propellers, because they are just noisy by design. Okay, you cannot just replace them, make some kind of smooth edge, and hope that it will be silent out of the set. And having looked around, we realized that there's but a couple of technologies which could potentially work, and one of those was horizontal axis propulsion system, which is kind of a blend of a wing and a propeller. So we've been out of options. We had the only solution which might work. The problem was that nobody before us has tried to upscale it to be real product. So that's backstory, Marty.
Oh, so where are you today? I mean, have you? I have the impression that you've done some test flying already.
Yes. So the swing flies, although in very limited envelope, we had initial flights outside last September. Then we packed for winter time in a very large testing facility where we've been fine-tuning flight systems. And now we have a solution which is ready for, endurance testing, maximum flight altitude testing, adverse weather operation kind of testing. It's been prepared for this final pre-flight.
And then, of course, can you tell something about the schedule? Because I can imagine that if you had already something to disclose, it would be already available. So you are clearly, you want to accomplish some testing before you disclose more technical data. Any idea when our anticipation will be fulfilled with actual reports on your performance?
Yeah, I think that the investors know more than you guys do, so we try to be as open to the investors and potential investors as possible. We had progress made, we had videos, we had kind of clients visiting our site, we've been giving demos to them. There is one issue which might explain why we cannot do this kind of testing and put it live on YouTube. It takes like 6 months of paperwork to fly this aircraft in civil airspace, okay? And if you make kind of design modifications, you need to revisit the paperwork. Therefore, you cannot legally fly it unless you have this paperwork done, or you can potentially fly it in some kind of military restricted area, which is also an option. So what we do now is we try to do these kind of flights with a kind of a little tether underneath, such that, it cannot suddenly lose control and fly to some kind of neighboring city or school or something like that. So we've been cautious not to risk too much. And, that penalty for illegal flight is basically a €1,500 fine, B, confiscation of aircraft. And we only have one. So lots of issues, on the legal side. Other than that, again, we have only one aircraft, and we want to make sure that the first real flight, the demo, doesn't end up in disaster.
Sure, and that makes perfect sense on that side. And I would like us to go back to the technology in a second, but just because we talked about investment, so you've raised, how much capital have you raised so far? Who is your ideal investor going forward? Right, and because again, that's part of this podcast, is to help companies find the right investors, right? Sure. So who have you got so far on the cap table?
Yes, 18 months ago we have closed our pre-seed round, which was a little less than 900K. Victoria, which has already been here, is one of our investors, and I think we have been super lucky to be in this country and this particular time. 2 years ago, we had already a mature angel community which saw potential in defense technology, saw potential, to scale it, and saw potential to sell it to NATO countries and to Ukraine. We had investors who have not been afraid of, defense and even offensive technologies. And I can see that Europe is now catching up with Lithuania, but only after 2 years. Our cap table is all the, Lithuanian kind of angels and the 2 Lithuanian VCs, and we are very happy to have them on board. Also, I am very happy that our current investors acknowledge the challenges of deep tech. So, and that's double problem basically. First, 2 years ago we've been, building defense solution. Then we've been into dual use and deep tech, and that's like double risk for a casual investor. Either you are deep tech, doing some kind of fancy lasers, quantum, or you are a defense which is building something super simple, like, I don't know, artillery shells, for example. Okay, but if you're trying to invent new kind of aircraft which aim to sell to defense clients primarily, and if technology has not yet been tested for like the last 80 years or so, well, you are under high risk profile.
Yeah, you certainly don't want to be in the quadrant which is uninvestable. And then, so
Exactly.
So Co-Invest Capital and the squad of Lithuanian angels, double thumbs up.
Yes.
When are you raising again this later this year? How much are you looking for? Who would be an ideal investor?
Yeah, so we are now trying to, ramp up production of our aircraft. We aim to produce them in Germany with a very respected company, which is kind of providing building components to automotive industry primarily. So we are now closing 3 mil seed round to ramp up production. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it's just, for covering expenses of initial batch. So approximately 5 aircraft, which are going on the demo campaign across Europe, also going to India, to Canada later this year. So yeah, this is just to fund this initial batch of real products, and we cannot sell prototypes. That's a challenge. And the larger your prototype, the more expensive your product is. And normally you either stick to one, but then your kind of sales campaign is just going in one thread. If you want to go in 5 threads simultaneously, automatically you need 5 aircraft. For example, Marty might be surprised, but we are shipping 2 to Finland to our partner Maverick Defense. We are shipping a couple more to Norway. We're shipping a couple more to Ukraine. So everyone is waiting for those aircraft already. It's just that clients have to test them. They still have to polish the missions because nobody has actually flown that kind of systems before. A heavy cargo aircraft which can fly hours, not minutes, contrary to casual drones. So, Marty, I forgot to answer your question if there are any other, aircraft in this segment like the ones we are building. So of that scale, of that kind of super silent machines, there are none, and there can't be any unless we go for the same technology like we do. So there's just one competitor in Austria who is trying to commercialize the propulsion systems, but we took a different route. We tried to actually build aircraft with this kind of novel propulsion systems, not just propulsion systems themselves. So I was always telling, to investors and everyone outside, it's very hard to sell a jet engine when you do not have a jet aircraft itself. Okay, possible, but use case is the best example, for clients that the solution works and works better than legacy solutions. So yeah, so we are raising a 3 mil round, a little bit higher than that. Start producing these aircraft, and at the same time, we try to showcase that we can build these aircraft at large quantities with minimal time frame with automotive-like scalability. Okay, it's really cheap to build them. It's just a carcass, a rotor, and a flight control system. That's it.
And are these unmanned, or do you have a pilot inside?
Currently, these unmanned versions. We do not plan to have pilots inside, and this is actually the shift in industry which is happening now. If you look, Lockheed has announced their autonomous helicopter solution. Airbus has announced it. Leonardo has announced it. Robinson has announced it. So we try to de-risk this main factor, expensive, skilled pilot on board the aircraft, which you don't want to risk losing during the conflict. So technically, I don't know how to name the aircraft which doesn't have pilot, but potentially could have people as casualties being transported, for example. Is it manned or is it unmanned? Technically, it's manned, but without pilot.
Well, I mean, you are absolutely right with that. But I mean, the key question really is that if it is piloted or unpiloted, that's really the question. Then if you have somebody inside with no skills or even ability to do anything, I mean, they are just cargo.
Yes, and that's a harsh reality. So basically, we've been talking to Ukrainians a lot, and we tried these large cargo drones made by a well-known British company, which was later acquired by Biosystems, as far as I can recall. We tried to, put a stretcher with wounded soldier underneath that large drone, and that just failed totally because somebody has to supervise the the person who's in shock, who might be in severe pain, you cannot just strap it, to the stretcher and let it fly for 10 minutes or 20 minutes. So, it's good that we've been told about these potential issues already 4 years ago. So we didn't have to redesign anything. We have helicopter-like machine with huge cargo compartment, enclosed space. 2 to 3 people can fit on board, so not an issue for us. So
super interesting. And who's the team building this? Because I see where you're building it. Lithuania is an amazing place. I'm a big fan. But I think that as you said, this is a really difficult one because you're in this deep tech meets defense kind of crosshairs. So who is the team that you've managed to attract? What have they done before? And what are the sort of challenges, because you fell in love with the problem, that you had to kind of address?
That's a good question. We had really we attracted really talented team of guys who have been previously, working at NASA, Rainier Engineering, but we had 2 phases in company's history and existence. It was hardcore R&D phase, and all these talents have been super helpful, to get us where we currently are. I myself, I'm a technical co-founder. I have master in physics, not in aerospace, but in physics. Anas, another co-founder, is more of a business person, a business angel. A diverse team, really skilled, but we couldn't use much of the kind of competences we have because this is a new tech. So literally, the team has grown, and they kind of, had to learn along the way how this, super complicated technology works. And, when you try to read through the scientific publications and articles, now after 4 years, you see that we barely scratch the surface of the problems which had to be solved in order to make these solutions fly. So remarkably, we thought we'll be dealing with huge aeronautical complexities, simulations, flow analysis, but reality was such that it was 90% of hardest problems were just simple mechanical issues. Vibration, connection, how to make something more rigid, strong, prone to elastic deformations, etc., etc. It once again proves that the solution which we have is closer to automobile, cost complexity-wise than to aircraft. And so currently the team is transitioning. We are trying to onboard a couple of persons who could help us with the production, with supply chain management, with kind of quality assurance processes. These are competences which we have to fill. These are gaps currently. And so companies finished with R&D, now it's transitioning to manufacturing.
Super interesting. Sorry, Marty.
I have a very, it may sound like a stupid question, but you have 2 rotors in
Yes.
in the vehicle. Are these 2 rotors, are they mechanically connected to each other, or are they totally separate?
We are totally separate, and I know where you're headed, and actually it would be super nice to just spin them synchronously. The forces would compensate nicely, and you could have kind of a balanced machine in the air. But what we have, and we took a slightly different, more complicated approach. We saw the potential in controlling this aircraft using torque, and so I dare to claim that this is the first aircraft which has ever been built to be controlled by torque and torque only. So let's say in casual drone, casual aircraft, you have thrust of some kind. It's just sucking in, outputting here, okay? And it allows us to balance itself in flight, like just quadcopter does. But if you have 2 large spinning wheels, you can actually have a stable flight with just controlling the, difference between RPM of 1 and the second. And this is much more complicated approach, but so this beast, which is now weighing 300 kilograms empty, can change its attitude within milliseconds, and this huge mass can be shifted, nose up, nose down, like it weighs nothing. Mm-hmm. So for that reason, we control it asynchronously, and for that reason, it has 2 individual electrical motors, high power motors, each producing up to 1,000 Newton meters of torque, and it took us, I think, 4 or 5 months to stabilize this thing in air, but now it works. Any more questions, Marty?
Well, I mean, there's so much questions that I don't want to I don't want to take this whole podcast to be a detailed technical thing. All I want to say is that it will be very, very interesting whenever you have more information that you can release. It would be very nice to have a copy of that and really understand the solutions and the choices of design that you've made. But not going to start milking you by hand, getting tidbits of data from you. I'm patient enough to wait.
No, and Donatus, we absolutely love this because I was like, oh, come on, let's do the technical thing. And I was like, and Marty's like, actually, this would go too deep. And again, this is super interesting because, again, I love the fact that you were able to frame this around. We had this really difficult R&D phase. We thought it was going to be one thing, and actually, we turned out to be solving another type of problems. And then I equally love the fact that one of the challenges now for your company is that not just get to market, but get to manufacturing. How can you design this thing for manufacturing? I also love the fact that you talked about, okay, we're going to utilize, Germany, the underutilized German automotive businesses to basically develop this type of frontier. And again, I've just recently looked at, there was a really good episode around the Mars drone. Did you see this helicopter that
Yes.
NASA had flying on Mars?
Yes.
And I love the fact that they used off-the-shelf components from a Samsung S5 and a Google Pixel phone to basically get this thing to not just fly on Mars, but also go way beyond its kind of 30 sol kind of period. And it kind of felt like you're channeling a lot of the same energy, which is actually we need to use the off-the-shelf components within the automotive industry. We need to utilize the skills of manufacturing. We need to solve the physics problems, and we utilize the ability of utilizing electric motors and the electric stack and the electric slide that are all going on. But actually now the challenges are manufacturing and a supply chain and a cost perspective.
So I couldn't agree more, but so it is still a very complex technology from the way it behaves, okay, and the way it works. And so, it's very hard to understand why it's, shifting forward and back and tilting to this or other angle. And so I think that, again, we are leveraging, the very unsolved fundamental challenge of physics, which is turbulence, and this device is primarily turbulence driven. So from R&D perspective, there is endless opportunity to keep diving into this problem and understanding more. As I said, we barely scratch the surface of this, kind of functionality, the way it works, the way we could actually control it. But at the same time, we've been faced with the dilemma to make it super simple, easy, producible, scalable machine. So as you correctly pointed out, we had to rely on COTS, commercial official components primarily. But even those, everything is emerging. Like high voltage batteries, 4 years ago, there were none. Now industry is already trying to realize that 800 volts and 1500 volt systems are lighter, easier to produce, to fast charge than, 400 volt systems. So, it's impossible to get rid of these, state-of-the-art solutions in your aircraft. They all have issues. The same happens, let's say, with flight control systems. We have like triple redundant flight system, which is super awesome, but nobody before us has ever tried building solutions which are controlled by torque. Why would you need such a thing? And whenever you look into any components that we had to literally either modify it heavily or redesign it from scratch. And one last comment which I have to make is that, we didn't come up with, the most perfect design possible. On the contrary, we failed with the design, I would say, and we had to try all the possible attempts. Let's say how, which are the rotor spin directions, how do you place the motors at the top and the rear, what are the distances, what are the positions, and basically we had to take and try all the possible configurations in order to find the one that works. And it takes time. And you cannot just go back to investors on weekly basis and say, okay, so that didn't work. We are now trying something different. And on the day after, again, that didn't work. We're trying something different. So yeah, these deep tech problems are just, so huge, but like we are past that.
My goodness, I just so love that. Again, there's a whole conversation that we could have around investor management and getting them aligned with the mission and the timelines.
Yes.
But there is a question I want to ask you. Well, obviously, what about the regulatory sandbox that you can play with, which is either do this thing on a military base that will come with its own set of constraints, or fill in 6 months worth of paperwork to do it another way. And obviously, we saw a real breakthrough with Zipline in their partnership initially with the Rwandan government. And if people aren't familiar with Ziplines, this is basically delivering blood supplies across rural Africa to hospitals and saving lives. And it was the partnership between Zipline, this tech company out of San Francisco, and the Rwandan government, and the regulatory sandbox playpen that they gave them to operate, which enabled Zipline to basically really pioneer these autonomous drone flights. Is that something we need in the geographical center of the universe? Sorry, Europe. What does Lithuania need to do to enable companies like yours to make this flying car, Peter Thiel would be super happy, kind of leap forward?
So first things first, if you fly in military airspace, we totally own it, and they can issue flight permit whenever we want. Easy peasy. Certification-wise, aircraft is being checked for its operational capability. You have to prove that it delivers as per specification. You have a client. That's it. Other than that, sales process normally takes 2 years, okay, which is long. Marta is probably knowing these issues better than I do. Regarding civil airspace, this is a very interesting aspect. Everyone is, talking about Europe, its regulations, all these, bottle caps, which you cannot pull away. But there is one, kind of capability where Europe is really ahead and, a lot compared to United States and rest of the world. It's the autonomous traffic management in the air. So Europe put huge money to eliminate, human operators from these flight control towers. And it's a program which is ongoing like for 16 years already. And literally all the major cities in Europe has infrastructure which allows you with just a simple smartphone to ask for a flight permit. It automatically issues you the particular flight corridor, which is prioritized according to what kind of service you have to deliver. Is it just a cargo? Is it some kind of emergency helicopter flight? And the infrastructure is there. The problem is that there are no aircraft which can meet the other regulation, sustainable and silent operations. So, so Europe is really leading in that kind of regard. And regarding the paperwork, so the paperwork is necessary for you to fill if you do not have a certified aircraft. Certification is expensive. It costs for us, it would be like 20 plus million euros. But, you can still fly them under specific operational risk assessment under condition that you pose no risk to somebody on the ground. Like you do not fly above city centers, you do not fly above kindergarten, schools, some kind of water, reservoirs. So it's really that easy nowadays to fly in civil airspace under condition you do not pose risk. And we have not integrated this kind of UTM, unmanned traffic management capability into our aircraft, but it's really, already available out of the box, which I'm very happy and proud, of.
Oh, look, it's wonderful. I'm smiling all over my face. It's wonderful to hear that Europe is world class, not just at a regulation and the infrastructure to deliver it, and that potentially gives us a competitive advantage. And regulation's always there pretty much for a reason, and you described the reason perfectly. But that sounds really exciting, that again, if we can get through the certification stage, actually it's almost like a flight plan is an API call away.
Yep, exactly. And so, as a matter of fact, Lilium, I think, is a German company which had issues recently. We had this Lilium jet, which we wanted to produce, but like 5 years ago, I was talking to the guy who was actually running this kind of integration department, and they put huge money into this kind of smartphone app, which allow you to call in the air taxi and, to the place where you're physically located and plan the flight path for you. So that was already available like 5 to 6 years ago. They just had no aircraft at the time.
Super interesting. Marty, final questions.
Well, I mean, of course, I'm mostly, rather than putting any pressure on you guys, but still, when do we hear more? When is the next time we should be meeting and hearing the latest and the greatest news you have?
So we have a very busy summer schedule ahead. We have to be in 3 major NATO drill exercises already with our aircraft. We have to be in Nordics later in the summertime. We have to be in India. India is a very big market for us, a huge market, as a matter of fact, bigger than all the NATO member states combined together, apart from the United States. I'm sure that we'll be doing PR campaigns on bi-weekly basis. But now we have another issue to handle is the production. And we are doing lots of negotiations. We're signing lots of MOUs, LOIs, contracts, because it's not only the one who is producing aircraft for us. All the component, all the nuts and bolts have to be contracted. And so we are really super busy, and we have round closure, which is still ongoing. But we had good progress with that, but it's still happening. If we are lucky, so this kind of solution is really super profitable. I mean it because we can produce it really cheap, nowhere near compared to the helicopters, and we can potentially run on much higher profit margins. So this is, you put huge money, you take huge risks, but the kind of payoff is much greater than on just casual drone company which is building something like Zipline has. With all due respect, but it's easy to build a small drone nowadays. It's easy to scale drone factory, but if you're building something closer to helicopters, it's only a handful of primes who are doing this nowadays. It's very hard to compete with primes, but we see that the shift is happening. Clients are unhappy about helicopter unscalability. They are not willing to wait for 2 to 4 years to receive a handful of Blackhawks. That's very much the case. They are not willing to risk pilot lives on a battlefield. That's very much the case. So, we are solving the problem which will emerge after 2 to 3 years.
That's fantastic. Okay, so we'll definitely keep posted. But I do have to ask, apart from it's a huge country with a huge population, why is India such a particularly good market for you guys?
Well, that's a very interesting story. You heard that 1 year ago, India had issues and clash on the Pakistan border. But at the time when this, issue emerged, they had all their helicopter fleet grounded. So India is building their own helicopters, Rove helicopters, DHR UAV, and they had kind of major problems and multiple helicopters crash. The whole fleet was grounded for investigation. And when you have a conflict, you have to resupply the troops in the mountains, and you're using donkeys for that. That's the harsh reality. And so, they learned the lesson that should never happen again. We have to be prepared, to resupply the troops at any cost, and our helicopters might fail again. And where do you buy 300 helicopters from within next year or two? Nobody can produce that quantity for you. So you have to rely on something different. And therefore, we come as a savior with a solution which is already mature, which can be scaled at large quantities. And the same story goes with Thailand. We had a clash with Cambodia.
Yeah, of course.
Same problems, jungle, somebody has to supply the troops. You can see the pattern is emerging here.
We can see how the Lithuania is producing international rescue. You are coming to save the world. And then this is a good thing. And again, the caricature, as you said, which is very sad, the donkey going up the hill to get the troop down, and the length of time it takes up and the length of time it takes down. Oh my goodness, what a huge opportunity.
Ukraine, it's a different topic. It takes another hour to discuss, but we have all the possible problems you can imagine. But the highest above all of those problems is capability to, extract and rescue people. We cannot afford losing yet another soldier on the battlefield. And most of the lives are lost not because somebody is, killed on the front line, but because it couldn't be rescued in the golden hour within, 45 minutes. Yeah, this is definitely our go-to-market for starters.
Oh my goodness. Oh, look, I love the fact that it's a sad story, but I love the fact that India is the big market. I'm a huge India fan. I spent a lot of my time in India. It's a country with such amazing potential. And again,
Yes.
if you can, it's a country of huge scale, right?
Yes.
So America's a big place, but India it's bigger. And not just in so many ways. So again, if this sort of solution can help, it will make such a big difference to so many lives. So Donatas, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We are very, very interested, and we love this sort of company that's moving from kind of product to manufacturing. So we'll definitely keep in touch, and we'll definitely get you guys back on the podcast and feature you more, because I think this is a great story worth telling.
Totally.
And whenever you have some material that you wanna or you're able to disclose to us, please have it coming. We are looking forward to hearing any progress you make.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for opportunity, and bye.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. To make sure you catch us again, please follow us on your favorite podcasting platform.